Hello, welcome to Psych 319, Chapter 8, Part 2. Ongoing discussions about consciousness. It should come as no surprise through actual experience, TV, or any movies you might have seen that drugs can alter your consciousness, and particularly in the 1960s, this was the topic du jour. Drugs were hitting mainstream uh, the mainstream, and people were using hallucinogens and all sorts of crazy stuff that would alter their consciousness. And because there were no immediate consequences, people saw them as a great way of getting insight to life and so on and so forth. We have now discovered, of course, that there are many physiological and long-term consequences for drug use, use of narcotics, and so on and so forth. So that has sort of tapered down a bit, to say the least. But what drugs do is they manipulate the way the way the neurons communicate with each other, and in essence, the way the nodes in the information network of your brain work. So if you interfere with those nodes in the network, you basically alter consciousness. That's the information processing standpoint on drug use. But you can have things that alter overall neural system activity, like depressants or stimulants, or you can have very specific things that alter just one perceptual aspect or one cognitive aspect. Um, Drugs, for example, like LSD, can affect the dopamine pathway, and that can too much dopamine ends up causing hallucinations. You start to see things that don't exist, and it can cause all sorts of delusions of paranoia or delusions of grandeur, things like that. So again, drugs alter consciousness. Very simple lesson. But there are other things that alter consciousness. Your diet can alter your consciousness. Obviously, if you have a very poor diet or you're malnourished, then your body doesn't have the ability to produce enzymes it needs for neural function, and then it leads to usually just a lowered state of vigilance. You don't have as much attention. You don't have resources to draw upon, and therefore you don't have the ability to attend to things very well, so your consciousness is altered. There are beneficial things to improving your diet and meditation, exercise. All of these things have shown to have benefits by reducing stress and pain, and that contributes to your well-being. So there's a whole field dedicated to this, positive psychology, the idea that you might be okay now, but you could be a lot better. How can we make you a better, more happier person? And how can we alter your consciousness in a positive way to help you achieve more? That field found its origins in sports psychology, but has now been extended to many other fields, industrial organizational psychology, and so on. So there are many theories of consciousness. Again, I'm going to skip over these. They're very well detailed in your books, but I'm going to talk about some of the key features that might be inherent to all of them. This idea of the brain being an expert processor. I'm going to ask you the question: does this sound similar to you? That you might have one part of your brain being responsible for the consciousness, and other parts of your brain acting as slaves. Um, I'm going to ask you whether you feel that's a valid argument. Um, it is true that in our brain, in accordance with Barr's theory, it is true that we have a number of processes that are automatic and a number that are not. And so there is this kind of fuzzy dividing line between intentional and automatic processes. And intentional processes require attention, effort. Um, they're not easy. We usually associate these things with explicit memory. And by contrast, automatic processes, or things that a zombie could do, um, involve implicit memory, um, more basic, how shall we say, stimulus response reflexes, um, and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of fuzzy dividing line that people are trying to draw between conscious and unconscious performance, and it's really depends upon the definition. It depends on how you define each task. So a lot of research has been done with priming. We talked about semantic priming in the past, and again, priming is the idea that the brief presentation of a word um, might cause a reduced reaction time for certain words that are closely associated with it, but won't cause an increase, or will cause an increase, sorry, let me rephrase this. That a particular word like bread will prime a word like sandwich because they're frequently paired together. And therefore, if you see the word bread, you're going to respond to the word sandwich more quickly in some type of reaction time task. But some other word like airplane that is not associated with bread would have a relatively slower reaction time. And so what we find is that lexical priming seems to indicate that there's some kind of subconscious automatic process that is separate from your conscious awareness that allows you to make links between concepts and ideas without your effort or involvement. So you can try and you can try and alter a performance on this task, but you will never be as fast on bread airplane as bread sandwich without lots of training. Another very interesting concept is the idea of metacognition. Metacognition is the notion that you are aware of your own thinking processes, and this is used today to distinguish between cognitive abilities between species, between adults and babies, between plants and humans, what makes somebody conscious. A lot of people define it as metacognition. So they might look at the dog and say, well, the dog is unaware of its own thought processes, therefore it's not conscious. It's a bit of a speciesist argument. I say speciesist like you would racist. I think that defining consciousness by metacognition is a little bit kind of like like judging all dogs by human standards, and that's not necessarily fair. I think that animals have their own ability to negotiate their environments, and they use whatever cognitive tools are the most useful for them. A dog has adapted to do what it needs, and we've adapted to do what we need. Obviously, we do seem to be more capable of higher cognitive abilities, but that's, again, defined by our own standard. So metacognition involves self-knowledge, monitoring of your own behaviors and your own thought processes, the ability to evaluate what you know or you don't know, the ability to also take the viewpoint of another person. I acknowledge that I'm conscious, but I also acknowledge that you're conscious based on the behaviors that I see you do and the judgments that I see you make. Yeah, let me, before I skip off here, I'll actually read to you just a little excerpt from an article I'm writing for Scientific American right now. And don't distribute this. It's hot off the presses, not really prepared yet. But a reader wrote into Scientific American and asked, what are the structural differences between the brains of animals that are self-aware and the animals that are not? And, well, the typical way to use to define consciousness or metacognition was this test called the mirror test. And the idea is that you would take a chimpanzee, color their eyebrow while they were sleeping, and then give them a mirror in the morning. And if they use the mirror to inspect the colored eyebrow on their forehead, then you know that they're aware that the image that they're seeing in the mirror is actually them. They have a sense of self-awareness, and and that's an indicator of metacognition, and therefore we believe that chimpanzees are conscious. Now, some monkeys do not pass this test. That includes usually lower primates like marmosets and so on and so forth, tamarins, lemurs. They don't tend to pass this test. Dogs, cats, they look at the mirror and they think there's something else there. They think there's another animal there. They're easily fooled. They don't even see that when they make a movement to the left and the animal makes a movement to the right, that it's actually the same person. And so this test, the mirror test, has been used as a dividing line to determine which species are consciousness and which ones aren't. And I find fault with the test because the test um, is not necessarily the best indicator. And what's interesting is certain animals like chimps will pass and orangutans will pass, but gorillas won't pass. And you'll have animals like dolphins and elephants will pass. So it is an interesting example of how we've divided the animal kingdom based on metacognition, providing you with the text here in more detail. But so what brain areas do they share? Well, the prefrontal cortex is an area that's involved in planning. And there has been a notion, the idea that species with a highly evolved prefrontal cortex are the ones that have metacognitive ability. And there are examples where, for example, animals that can make decisions about delay of reward, for example, when a rat is given a choice between a quick reward or the choice to delay delay a response to get a better reward later. If they're able to delay that gratification, then it shows that they have the ability to reason, and instead of just operating on stimulus response mechanisms, that they can decide and make a conscious choice to delay gratification, and that's a sign of metaconsciousness, that they have awareness of their own consciousness by belaying immediate gratification to get a better reward later. And they find that the orbital frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex lights up in rats that make a decision like that. So it seems that this area, across species, some aspect of the frontal cortex is involved in sort of anticipating reward. And if an animal can anticipate a reward, then it's likely they have an understanding of their relationship to reward. They have an identification of their own behaviors, how they respond to stimuli, and they can control their behavior in response to what stimuli are out there. So that's the current operating hypothesis, but does that mean that prefrontal cortex is the seat of consciousness? No, it's probably just a very important part of being able to mitigate your behavior, to not act like a base animal, but to make conscious choices based on the stimuli that are presented in front of you, to make more evaluative choices, to make more informed choices. So anyway, you might be able to glean what I'm talking about by reading through this text. And otherwise, I hope you have some new perspective on your own consciousness, and can consider that in relationship to the other processes that we've studied already, like sensation, perception, attention, memory, and so on and so forth. As we get into other processes, I think consciousness should always be at the seat of your mind. Again, thanks for your patience. See you next week.